Hello and welcome to Agile Rising's webinar, Strategic Planning, Connecting Strategy to Execution. It's great to have you here and joining us. My name's Chris Ruch. I'm the CEO of Agile Rising, and I am going to be one of the folks leading the conversation here today about strategic planning. And I'm joined by Michelle Gilboy.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. So Michelle Gilboy, I'm the CEO of Upwards Consulting. Great to be here.
And I'm looking forward to our conversation, Michelle. Michelle and I have worked together for the better part of a decade on various efforts from strategic planning and organizational transformations. And we're here today to talk about why strategic planning is important and how executing on that strategy is equally as important. We're having this conversation. I think it's a very timely conversation. A lot of organizations are moving into their strategic planning part of the year if they're on an annual cycle. I think we'll talk about cycles and talk about timing of some of these things. We know a lot of strategic leaders are moving into thinking about what comes next, what are they going to focus on, and so today's conversation is going to be kind of picking Michelle's brain here with her experience and about leading strategic planning efforts and sharing some of the experience that Agile Rising has helping customers with their strategic planning processes. So, Michelle, can you talk a little bit about your background and your role in strategic planning and kind of what makes you an expert in what we're talking about here?
Yeah, sure. So kind of giving a nod to how we met along the way, it was primarily leading transformations or being part of transformations. And a lot of times there's as part of your transformation, it's simply getting very clear and focused in on what are we needing to do, and then how are we going to execute on it, and finding out where kind of the problems are in doing so. So along the way, I've had the opportunity to either build strategy myself, and so I understand the challenge firsthand. And then I've also been on the side of how do I facilitate that, as well as being a person who's responsible for executing on strategy many times in my life. So I've had a lot of experience. I've had a lot of lumps, and I've had a lot of successes alongside of my own, but with others as well.
Awesome. Before we jump into things here for our participants and audience, we will have a question and answer period kind of at the end of the presentation and conversation here. So please use that question and answer functionality in the Zoom, and we will go through those questions and answer them at the end of our conversation. So to kind of dig down into it, but when we're talking about strategic planning, right, there's a variety of different kinds of strategic, or a variety of different kinds of planning. And to frame the conversation here, how do you define strategic planning, and what makes strategic planning different from typical planning or budgeting that an organization might do?
Yeah, sure. Great way to start. So I think so. One thing I'll kind of level set on is what you see here, and then I'll talk about strategic planning. So I think to level set, because we use the word strategy, I know when I enter an organization, strategies used in different ways. So just to level set, when I'm talking about strategy today, and maybe you want to bar this going forward, anyone listening, but it's a unified set of choices that position you on a playing field in a way with which you win. And so when I think about strategy, right, the strategy itself, it should be focused in on things that we don't control, right? So we don't control the customer. We don't control those outcomes. And it's a theory because really like it, on the time horizon, we're kind of trying to predict the future, taking as much information about our customer, our competition, along with information about our own organization, but we're really formulating a theory. And so we're trying to figure out what are the unmet needs in that theory. And then, because it is a theory, I think this is one of the things that's commonly missed about strategy, is that you need to iterate on it. Right. I worked in places, in organizations where they're like, yeah, we really don't need to change theory. Maybe you don't, but it's unlikely that we've kind of guessed into the future perfectly. And what then that means is, as we translate that into strategic planning, which is, the process by which we understand how do we realize or advance that strategy, which is usually on a long time horizon, what are the things that we need to do, next or in the near term that are going to advance that. And so when we're looking at, like the strategic planning, it incorporates a lot of different pieces, like you said, right? Budgeting is a way of planning, so on and so forth. We need kind of all of those perspectives when it comes to strategic planning. But really what we're talking about is, how do we move from strategy, which for me, I think the best experiences I've either had myself or I've seen the companies I work with, they do strategy development separate from the strategic planning. So because you have like this different time horizon, right? You really need analysis on your customer, competitor, like a smaller group of people, to really figure out where are we going to head. And then you start to do that translation. And that's where you make sure that everybody's involved. They're all following along and understanding. So I think that's, when we're kind of talking about strategy development, strategic planning, that's how I think about those things.
And you hit on a couple kind of really important and key things there. For me, when I think about strategic planning, it's really the things that are going to make a big difference in the future of the organization, right? You're bringing a new product to market, you're entering a new market, you're doing a large transformational effort or reorganization or a merger or acquisition, right? It's the big stuff, right? So we're not talking about what's the next feature to build, or what's the next, incremental improvement in something that's existing. It's what are those big things that's going to be, a year, 3 years, 5 years down the road, how are we going to be different? And that a really key point there with it's a theory, that another way I like to think about it is that it's a bet. You're taking a risk, and you're saying, hey, we're going to try to bring a new product to market to satisfy a customer's need, and we have a theory about how that's going to work, and that's either going to work or it's not going to work. So I think having that iterative nature to be able to look at what is working, what isn't working, what bets are paying off, what theories are working out, what theories are not working out, are the really key aspects for an effective strategic planning, as opposed to that kind of day-to-day advancing the existing products, advancing the existing markets that we have, which is your kind of normal cadence of planning.
Yeah, and I think one of the biggest distinctions, I mean, there's many distinctions, but one of the biggest distinctions that you reminded me of is that, again, going back to strategy, these are the things that we don't control. It's the future, right? So it's about influencing. And when we look at our strategic planning, it's not to say that we can control everything, but we really are talking about the things that we control: our resources, our skills, our money, right? How do we apply our capacity, things of that nature.
And you just hit on one of my favorite topics, which is capacity.
Mhm.
And I think, that's a good kind of segue from what is strategic planning to how do we connect that strategic planning and that vision to how do we execute. And I'd love kind of your thoughts on how we move from having a vision of where we want to go to actually aligning that to something that's achievable through our execution.
Yeah. So I think there's a couple of things that I'll kind of highlight here. As you tee this up. And so one of them is, and capacity is one of my favorite. Prioritization and capacity are probably my two favorite kind of emphasis. But so when we're talking about connecting our strategy to that execution, all of us are looking for, right? If we show up to our job every day, the thing that makes life easier is if we have clarity on direction, if we have alignment. And when I'm talking about alignment, I'm not talking about like, oh yeah, nod your head, I'm aligned. I mean, like, I'm aligned to what we're doing. I want to show up here every day, so I'm inspired. And I think the last piece is that I am committed to this, and I'm hanging out with other people that are committed, and I know who's doing what, right? Getting clear on those kinds of things is strategy plays a huge point, or a huge piece in that direction part, but that alignment piece and then that commitment piece is where that strategic planning really comes into play. The thing that people really struggle with, and you touched on it, is what I forget, 4 disciplines of execution, I think is the name of the book. They talk about this whirlwind, right? The whirlwind is our daily lives. We show up to work every day, and there is a whole host of things that we either think that we have to do or being asked to do for a variety of different reasons. And strategy is about, like, what are the 1 or 2 things that we're going to put massive attention onto, in addition to the whirlwind, because that whirlwind, we can try to take some of it away, but that is our daily job. So I think the best thing that we can do is emphasize, like, get focus, right? So it's the focus piece of it. And when I look at even really good strategy, when I look at good strategy, it's often too conceptual for us to be able to action, right? So you have to have a way to take these concepts and turn them into targets. I remember the story of, like, so NASA in the early 60s, I'm too young clearly to know anything about this, but NASA in the early 60s, right, had this strategy or this vision that they wanted to be the world leader in space exploration. And meanwhile, in the early 60s, we were not that by a long shot. And so how do you execute on that? But then you had Kennedy kind of help start to target it a little bit for everyone, which is, we're going to put a person on the moon by the end of this decade and return them safely home. Right? Those are things then you can start to say, I can execute on that. And the best way that I've seen, and there's a lot of good examples of this in the world, and I think Google is the one who kind of brought this back into fashion, but it's OKRs, right? So using something like a goal setting system, OKRs, where you simply state what's your objective, hopefully in short cycles, right? So it feels quite tangible and real. And then what are the key results? I think that is what I've seen time and time again, really lights people up. There's an activity to it. The setting of the objectives is specifically connected to whatever your strategy is. What are those big bets that we want to make? And so if we want to make those big bets in the next, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, what are the things that we need to be doing right now? What's our immediate objective? And then what are the key results? And then that really helps to clarify. If you're doing it well, you're having conversations all along. The people that are setting those key results are the ones who are actually executing on it, and then they're using those key results to make decisions on what they're doing daily.
OKRs have become very popular in the last few years, but OKRs are not a magic bullet, and it's a good tool for capturing the output of a good strategic planning process and making things actionable. But one of the things that I often see is OKRs don't necessarily drive the alignment and the clarity and the prioritization that you mentioned, because organizations don't have a good process for creating the OKRs, right? And instead it becomes a competitive thing, right? You have your OKRs, I have my OKRs, instead of us having shared OKRs. So could you talk a little bit more about some of the specifics that you've seen work in driving actually getting leaders and leaders from across different parts of the organization to have that alignment and clarity? How does that happen in the strategic planning process?
Yeah. So there's a translation, like I said, from strategy. And when I'm talking about strategy, like the input into these conversations are these strategic choices that we made, right? So how I kind of like test whether we have a good strategy, like a good strategic choice or not, is if I see like better customer service or trusted advisor, build awareness. I usually do the test of like, if you would never want the opposite of that to be true, so you never want, you'd never say, well, we don't want better customer service. Like that's just a litmus test for me to know that we have at least a pretty good strategy. Because if you're creating strategy, you're making actual choices, right? So those choices, you need to be saying we're doing this instead of this. So I kind of start there, but I assume that going into the strategic planning and the creation of the OKRs, we have a pretty good strategy. We understand like what the behavior shifts we want to see in our customers or in the market, things like that, right? What experiences we want them to have. And then having our organizations have a bit of an operating rhythm to them, right? Yearly planning, quarterly planning, however, often you're doing it. And so it's just taking that kind of cycle and either getting real focused in on what are we doing. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean, okay, so strategy feeds are OKRs. That helps us understand where do we focus, but then we need to take those and as a collective group of leaders, right? So I think the worst examples I see happening is that you might have a leadership team of like 8 or 10 people, and each one of them has their own list of OKRs. And I'm not saying that's not a bad way to start. Like everybody has to think about what objectives do you want to contribute towards that strategy? But it really does take some coordination amongst your leaders to be able to whittle that down into what are the things that we're going to focus in on. And what I find most important, really important to that is that collaboration needs to happen. You need to get it down to a smaller list. And it's also, I kind of want to talk about who you're including here, because I think it's important too. I think it's very important that at the minimum, you have your leadership that is, kind of intimate and familiar with the strategy, starting to build those OKRs. And when it comes time to set those key results, don't set your key results until the people who are going to develop your key results and who are actually going to do the work understand these objectives. They understand the customer, they understand what we're trying, what they're trying to realize. And then that's where these conversations around, here's what we're trying to do. And listen, if you've been the person or the people that develop these objectives, I think your first job is to say, here's my draft. Here's what we came up with. But please, make these better, fight me on them, right? Invite them into that conversation. And then from there, as a collective, everyone involved starts to lay out what these key results are. And my preference is getting into a bit of, we saw the slide with the operating rhythm. What's the operating rhythm? There should be a rhythm for leader setting strategy, how often we're revisiting it, taking a look and redefining it. Same thing with the OKRs, resetting those objectives, and then inviting people in to set those key results.
Yeah, it's really, strategic planning is a process, and it's an iterative process, right? And it's important that the right people are involved at the right time, especially as it's moving from, the vision, what are the things we want to achieve, to moving to how are we going to achieve that, which is itself hopefully an iterative agile development process, or creative process. And one of the keys for me for successful strategic planning is one, having somebody own it. And I think a lot of time those kind of everybody having their own individual OKRs is because that's the level of where the ownership is, right? And there's not somebody crafting the overall OKRs. It's each organization, each department kind of doing their own. And the other is just not having good facilitation in those sessions. And I think well facilitated strategic planning processes, and I don't just mean a single workshop, I mean the whole series of workshops and planning sessions, and feeding the vision down to the more detailed OKR creation is really key.
Yeah, and I think something I'll add in here, and it's emphasized a little bit in this slide and maybe some other that Julia might show, but it is not uncommon, because we've talked about, your strategy, your OKRs, your objectives, and your key results. But you know what? In developing your strategy, in setting your key results, there's a whole host of assumptions that we are all making. And I find bringing visibility to those assumptions is incredibly powerful, because first of all, it helps us see that, our strategy is a bit of a theory. We had to make some assumptions. Maybe we didn't have all the data this quarter, but it also, helps then as you're kind of setting out, what are we going to execute on? Well, of these assumptions, like, are there any that are really risky that we need to test out? Because that then needs to become, part of what your work is. And then to your point, Chris, with the facilitation, it is truly a process. This isn't a day-long thing. And also just with the facilitation, I think the other thing strategic planning can be really soulless, right? I mean, it's just, there's no humanity to it if it's not done well. And I mean that in two ways. Number one, I think there's not enough emphasis. We of course should be emphasizing the business, but also, like, who are the people that we're impacting, or what are the unmet needs? And then as humans, right, those of us showing up to do strategic planning, that facilitation is really key for a number of different reasons. First of all, it's kind of awkward, when you're getting together with people that you don't work together with on a regular basis. And so that facilitation of how do we bring people together in a very thoughtful way, and make sure that before we make any decisions, we make creatively and collectively make decisions that, everybody has as much shared understanding as possible. And then that we're answering the right questions along the way. What are our big bets? What are we gonna, if all else, we're gonna put extra emphasis on these bets and not these other things. And then kind of walking us through of how do we take that and get more focused in on what are the big. I actually love this technique. It's called a pre-mortem. It's from NASA. Some of us may be familiar with it. You can Google it. It'll tell you how to facilitate it. But, once we understand what the big bets are, I love doing a pre-mortem with a large group of people, because that then gets some of the things that you're afraid of. So pre-mortem, if you're not familiar, is you kind of look into the future, maybe a year from now, and you ask the question, if everything's gone wrong, right? Patience on the table, everything's gone wrong. Like, what went wrong? And your technical people are going to have a perspective, and your operations people, like, everybody's going to bring their perspectives. I love getting those things out on the table, because those are the kinds of things where you can start to proactively, as you're doing your strategic planning, emphasize what is going to have the biggest impact to our success. And I like actually even doing that in advance of starting our planning. I'd like to just think really big, say what really scares us, what's on your mind, because that does help us understand, do we have the skills in our own organization? Do we need to build them? What are all the other things that are going on? Do we have that capacity? What technically, maybe that we assume that the technology is where it is, and it really isn't. It's not available to us, so on and so forth. So getting those things out of the table, then before we start to walk ourselves towards what are the goals that we really need to see right now that'll help us advance, and then finally just building out the what are we actually going to do? How are we actually going to hit those goals?
Yeah, and pre-mortems are a great approach to risk management as well. It helps you expose those things that are, hey, what's going to cause this to fail? What's going to cause it to not go well, so that we can plan around that or mitigate it. And it's also a good way of trying to kind of turn the, we tend to have perhaps elevated levels of surety that our idea is going to work, or we're excited about our own idea, and having a time and place to really think about alternative views and other ways of working. I think your other key there is, when we're talking about strategic planning, and particularly agile strategic planning, right? If we want an agile organization, business agility starts with the strategic planning process. And if you have that group of people doing strategic planning that don't normally work together, that's kind of a symptom of a siloed organization that maybe hasn't organized around the delivery of value, hasn't organized around value streams, hasn't organized in ways of trying to deliver on these strategic initiatives. So I think that's a great place to start with trying to break down the silos, right? If you have a siloed leadership team that's not working together on a frequent iterative basis, that's going to flow throughout the whole rest of the organization. It's going to be really hard to deliver with cross-functional teams and get out of those silos.
Yeah, I think it's so. Thanks for popping this up, Julie. If you can leave it up for just 1 second. Like, so we're touching upon this, like some of the common mistakes or common problems I see when it comes to strategic planning. One of them is optimism. Now, I called it disconnected activity, but I really do kind of, it's optimism or capacity, it's optimism, and a whole host of things. Silos is the other one, because that really disconnects ideas and people from each other. Right. And so that is whether we're doing strategic planning, right? And at the heart of it, anytime I'm sitting down with executives and we're doing kind of that strategic development, one of the things that we all highlight we want to avoid is, while we get so focused in on what we're doing, that opportunities are walking right past us, right? Because that is a kind of a, maybe not a common problem, but that's like, if you don't do this well, you get so locked into not, if you're not continually learning, you get so locked into execute on this plan to do all these things, and you forget this learning and sharing piece. There are opportunities that are going to walk right past you if you don't include that. So silos is kind of a piece of this. We've already talked about the lack of focus, right? How OKRs can help us do that, and how coordination and kind of creating those and picking, just a few of them. We're talking 3 to 5. We're not talking 20, 30, whatever. Missing the customer kind of highlighted this. It's a critical piece to create that empathy and help us understand that direction. And I think the two pieces that we haven't, because I want to open this up to questions, of course, but two pieces that we haven't maybe talked about quite as closely is one of them is the flawed measures. And the way that I think about measures and help people kind of set those measures, both strategy and execution measures. First of all, it was new to me to even think about setting measures for my strategy. It's very common to measure your execution, but I see it less common to measure your strategy. Like, how do you even know? Back to that thing about theory. Like, how do you even know? And it's a little bit harder to do. But end of the day, the advice that I kind of, I follow myself when I think about measures is, what are the what decisions do we need to make? Because that's really what measures should lead to, right? It's not like what are we curious about, like that, but like what kind of things should we be measuring that are going to help us make decisions or help change behaviors, kind of the other one that I focus in on. And that's true in terms of, measuring strategy and execution. So lack of attention there. And then I think the other one is that lack of commitment. Right. So we emphasize alignment, which is incredibly important, and bringing everybody along and kind of the buy-in. But the commitment piece is a particularly critical to us really realizing what we're doing. And it's a huge piece to the commitment. Right. That means at this point, everybody said, all right, I'm passionate about this, or at least interested enough. I'm aligned with what we're doing, and I'm going to do this. We're going to make this commitment to one another.
Yeah, and commitment is something that we often think of as an execution aspect, right? Oh, there's a deadline and things have to be done by the deadline, and we've committed to achieving the deadline, and kind of, and you need commitments at that level, but you also need commitments to driving the outcomes, right? Not just doing the work, but achieving the outcomes, and having that feedback loop where you're looking at the measures and you're looking at the leading indicators, like the assumptions that we built into this, and are we proving those assumptions, or are we disproving those assumptions, so that we can decide if we're going to continue to do this or not. So we do want to have some times for question and answers here, but I think it's good to spend a little bit more time digging in on kind of the horizons that we're looking at for strategic planning, and some specifics around what goes into each one of those horizons, and the timing and the cadence around what a good facilitated strategic planning process is.
Yeah. Yeah. And I use the time horizons, for organizations that would like to, kind of maybe eliminate or, flatten their organization or kind of change the attitude towards hierarchy. I think the time horizon is also a good backdrop to that, just as an aside here, is that, it's not that hierarchy necessarily is like these people are making these decisions, these people, right? It's also on the time horizon by which we do it. And there is so kind of to get specific and tie that to where you're going, Chris, which is that time horizon helps us get better focus. And so when we're looking at like the setting the strategy itself, right, we're looking at 24 to 60 months. Most people would say 3 to 5 years. I've actually altered that a bit. I mean, things are just changing more than ever. And so, when I said 3 to 5 years, 20 years ago when I was doing this, okay, but maybe your time horizon needs to change. So anyway, all that to say, we're looking at 20 to 60 months, and this is where we're looking at our direction, our big assumptions, what's our offering, what's our message. Then that typically will often, not always, but break down into some programs or projects that we're going to, kind of put focus on in the next, say, 12 to 20 months. So like year and a half. And this is where then we take that direction. We set those OKRs. Now, you may not need a time horizon for this 12 to 20 months. I don't see a lot of examples of that, but I do want to kind of point out that there's some flexibility here. But typically you see strategy on a 3 to 5 year, 2 to 5 year, your programs and your projects help you exit or emphasize what are we doing in the next 12 months to advance towards that strategy. And then you create this, if you're working in, depending upon what fashion you're working on, but some sort of backlog that says, okay, for the next quarter, what are we actually going to then emphasize? And that again, for me, is what are our objectives for these next 3 months, and what are the key results we need to see that are, kind of moving us towards that. And then that helps, if I'm working on a team, that really helps me get clear on, okay, so for the next month, what are we actually doing? My preference, of course, is to work in for the next week. What do I need to work on? But, at the very least, it's what are we doing in the next 2 weeks or next month?
Yeah, and so having those nested timelines also, that helps drive that alignment, right? That we're flowing the priorities, we're flowing the strategy down to more executable chunks, and we can also turn that into a feedback loop to go into the next round of planning and strategic planning and keeping our things fresh. And I think you're kind of highlighting there 24 to 60 months, and as we're getting into a faster moving world, and the market changes faster and technology changes faster and opportunities present themselves faster. I think it's also good to point out that your strategy sometimes needs to change right now, change on a dime, right? That things happen that are highly disruptive, like the pandemic, or natural disasters, or mergers and
Like
acquisitions.
somebody new enters your market, some new technology, right? We're seeing a lot of that with the advancements in AI, or at least the accessibility, right? Sometimes, if you're in a highly compliant organization, those
New
kinds of things.
regulation comes out, new law comes
Yeah.
out. Yeah. So, and that's where having that agile strategic planning process needs to come in, where you're like, oh, we just got done with strategic planning. We weren't planning on doing it for another year, but some major thing just came up and happened, right? So if we have that iterative cadence of being able to sense and respond to what's happening in the market, gives us the ability to, in a non-disruptive way, make rapid pivots to our strategy or reevaluate what we're doing um, in the right place, and then feed it into that. Hey, we know that we have logical places that we can make changes without creating organizational whiplash around changing priorities or ripping apart teams and reforming teams and things like that.
Yeah, very much so. Again, I want to be sensitive to time, because I could go off on a little bit of a kind of a different thing to highlight, but yeah.
I think we've covered a lot of ground. There are a couple questions that might give you a platform for talking about some other things. So I think Julia is going to walk us through some of the questions that we had there. Certainly, if you have any other questions, put them into the Q&A chat, and we'll cover them.
Yes, so it looks like our first question is, who in the organization has to do strategic planning? Who has to set the KPIs or OKRs? And how frequently should the planning be done?
Amazing. Chris, you mind if I
Go for it.
start on this one? We can kind of take turns here, add whatever.
Mhm.
So thanks for that question, and great question, because that was actually what I was gonna tag on to what Chris had just said. So the best advice that I can give you in terms of setting those OKRs, and I differentiate OKRs from KPIs. I heard kind of KPI in there. I differentiate them this way, right? When I'm thinking about OKRs, like I'm talking about the objectives and then the key results that we want to realize. It's kind of like directionally, where do we go? When I think about, like, if we're traveling in a car, this will be okay analogy. But if we're traveling in a car, like, where do we want to go? And then how do we check in along the way to make sure that we're headed in the right direction, and we're still going to get there on course. And my KPIs, I use KPIs as if almost like in my car, do we have enough fuel? Are the tires filled, right? So it's kind of those things. So I kind of distinguish them that way. When it comes to setting the objectives, I personally find that having a small group of people set the objectives, not for the purpose, like draft objectives. Let me be very clear, because again, there's a million ways to realize your strategy. I think having a small number of people say, okay, here's all the ways, and then having them kind of sort out, yes, there's a million OKRs we can have, or objectives we can have, but here are the few that we're going to do, is better done with a smaller group of people and then invite people to react to that. When it comes to setting those key results, I think the thing that's most important is including everyone that's going to be involved. And the reason I say that is, especially for the key results, the people who are going to execute on those results need to be setting them. So while, you know, I'm somebody who might be executing on those key results, I'm going to weigh in and make sure I understand what the objectives are so I can set the key results. I think that's important. So I need to be part of that conversation, or at least reacting to them. But when it comes to setting the key results, it is absolutely about the people who are going to be executing, setting those, owning them, committing to those.
Yeah, I would add to that who is involved is really dependent on the organization and the size of the organization, right? So in a small technology startup, who's involved is going to be different than who's involved in a Fortune 100 company or in a federal agency, right? So strategic planning and OKR development happens at different levels. And there can be nested planning. So strategic planning is, you know, ultimately the responsibility of the leadership of the organization. So, you know, in a you know, that's the C-suite for the organization. In a publicly traded company, that's the board of directors. Plays a role there in providing guidance to the CEO and to the C-suite, and then it may cascade down from there by line of business, by market segment, by big pieces of the organization. And so you may have multiple levels of strategic planning going on in the organization, and it's key that those are connected, that that's part of the facilitated process, that those are self-reinforcing, and that the capacity is being considered at each level of that planning. And taking into account the planning that's going on in other parts of the organization. And then from there, the OKRs also cascade into each part of the organization that's doing the work. So that's kind of who's involved is one of the really big keys, right? Getting the right people to come to the right meetings is one of the kind of art parts of this process. And then making sure that it's a valuable experience for them at their level.
Great. Another question we have is strategic planning is a big time and manpower investment. How do you help convince people in leadership, the organization, that it's time well spent and worth the investment?
Yeah, great question. I would think I'll start with kind of how do you convince people for the leaders of the organization, this should be one of their core responsibilities, and where we often see leaders who are kind of not really addressing strategic planning in a really highly engaged way, it's often because they're not getting the right direction or the right expectation setting from senior leadership, you know, from the board, from the C-suite, from the president or senior vice president of that line of business. So we really should be thinking about strategic planning as a core competency, core responsibility for leadership. And often that day-to-day keep the lights on, reacting to problems, reacting to production issues takes up the time and space that should be spent on strategic planning, or is quite honestly mentally easier to go and focus on, right? There's a problem, that problem needs to be solved. I can go and do that, or I can work with my team to do it, as opposed to envisioning where do we want to be 5 years from now and doing the research for that. So sometimes it's creating at the leadership level the focus to concentrate on what that core competency is. in terms of, it takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of people being focused on it. That's kind of a function of how frequently you're doing it. It's like anything, right? If you only do strategic planning on an annual basis, or you only do budgeting on an annual basis, then it's a big time consuming thing that, oh, suddenly we can't get any decisions made because all the leaders are in the annual budgeting and strategic planning process. But if you go through that big initial effort of what's our roadmap, what are the things that we're going to focus on, and then iteratively every quarter, every 6 months, you're revisiting that, it's a much less heavy lift. It just becomes part of the regular operational cadence that Michelle was talking about. So I'll kind of I'll challenge a little bit the assumption that it's a big commitment of time and effort, because that's a direct function of how frequently we're doing it, and it's also that's what your strategic leaders should be doing, right? Your leaders are responsible for strategy, so that should be among the highest priority things that they're doing, and maybe they're getting pulled off into distracting things instead.
There's this natural tension between important and urgent that we all feel, leaders as well, right? It doesn't matter what level, but part of the problem that like creates that whirlwind that we all get into, that say, oh, like we don't have time for doing these really important things for our organization, is that we're not actually putting the attention into strategy. We're not putting attention into the strategic planning. And so we're either caught off guard when certain things kind of happen, and we're not able to say yes or no to them, right? So then that just kind of makes the whirlwind even more. So I think, kind of there's that natural tension, good to recognize it. But as leaders, one of our responsibilities is, first of all, to minimize that and help people get focused. And the other thing is, as leaders, it's important for us to realize what's our role, because we kind of determine what's important in our organization. And so if we say like strategic planning or these commitments that we've made are important, but we don't revisit them or talk about them, it's really hard for other people to find them important in their day-to-day whirlwind as well. So
looks like we have another one. Are there any templates that can or should be used to hold the pre-mortem meeting prior to the planning?
I can take that one. We do have some standard kind of workshop agendas and templates. I think pre-mortems are much like postmortems or retrospectives, which is there's a really an infinite number of ways to do it, and you probably don't want to do the same workshop technique or the same template every time with a pre-mortem, because it ends up being less fun and less engaging, because it's, oh, this is the 10th time I've done the exact same sort of thing. So some of that gets down to having some broad principles, or taking a template and modifying the template for what you want to use it for, or having the facilitator's creativity to engage the team that's there. But so the answer is yes, but there's lots of different ways to do it.
there's a lot of good inspiration online.
Yeah.
NASA again was kind of the one who, I don't know if they coined the term, but they certainly made it famous for very unfortunate reasons. But you can read the whole story and see the variety that Chris is talking about.
And reach out to us after the webinar. We can share some additional details as well.
Yeah, I think you brought up an important point. Sorry, Julie, before we move on. I think you brought up an important point. I think when it comes to strategy development, there should be a process for that as well. Like, what are the inputs? What are the questions? I always I use a process that has prompting questions. And it's it's a bit of like a cyclical, like prompting questions, because I don't think when you kind of revisit your strategy, should you always go back to question 1 through 10, right? We should look at like what's changed, and maybe we need to revisit, prompting question 3 or whatever. But all that to say, for all of these things, for your strategy development, if you're doing, some sort of technique to identify your risks, as well as your strategic planning, this is a part of the facilitation piece. It's good to have a bit of a rhythm so that people do know, like, principle, at least at the principal level, what to expect. What are the big questions that we're trying to answer, even if your process isn't executed the same time every time, just so, keep it kind of interesting. I think that is fundamental to development of your strategy, to your strategic plan, and facilitating, any type of activity that you're doing.
Looks like we have one more question. How is the KPI progress being tracked so that strategic planning gets course corrected in the next iteration?
I'll kind of share my experience with this. I think there's probably maybe more varied ways, Chris, you can speak to, but my best experiences, I'll say this, my best experiences is that you do have an owner of this process, that you do have a cadence with which you are revisiting these things, and my best experience is where you also have a tool, right? There's a number of different tools that then make your strategy, your bold bets visible, and what are the objectives and key results. As Chris has said, they kind of cascade depending upon the context of your organization. But there's a number of different technologies and tools that can help you make that connection, all the way to, is the work that my team is doing, how does that then showing progress towards this objective, and cascading all the way up to the to the strategy.
Yeah, I'll completely echo your comments on that. It's a combination of having the process and the cadence where we're collaborating, right? And again, agile strategic planning involves actually collaborating and talking with each other and having back and forth. And you also have a tool that's capturing it and visualizing it and showing it and helping cascade it. So what I would add there is you need to start with, what do you want the process to be? How do we want to interact? When are we going to have those specific meetings where we're going to get feedback on what's working, what's not working, where we're going to make the pivot or persevere decision about, are we going to continue on this theory? Are we not going to continue on it? Are we going to modify it? Right? You need to have those specific meetings. And then you also have a tool that reflects it. And it's important that you get that order correctly, right? What doesn't work is, oh, we've gone out and bought a new tool to capture OKRs. Everybody here's a link to your OKR tracking tool, and then we're just kind of falling back into that planning and providing input into things individually instead of being aligned and having the clarity. And then in terms of tools, right, we're implementation partners with a bunch of tools that specifically do this, and catch some of our other webinars with our partners around the tools, and you can kind of see specifically how we kind of use some of those tools to capture OKR strategic plan and cascade them down. With one more caveat there, that when we're talking about strategic planning, we are sometimes talking about confidential information, right? New product development, where you're going into the future, is sometimes, corporate trade secrets or government secrets. And so sometimes there do need to be controls on those things, which makes more complex the aligning people to the execution and getting things out. But that's probably a topic for another conversation for how you accomplish that.
Yeah, but these tools in the process really are kind of hand in glove in, because people do complain about, like, Yeah, the statistics will tell you, like, people can't name their strategy. They don't actually know what the objectives are, and it does become stale. And so this process and the revisiting of it, and having a tool that can keep it kind of visible at your fingertips goes a long way to help avoid that. Cool.
Looks like there's just one last question, asking if this session is being recorded. Yes, it is being recorded, and a link will be shared.
And I think that's going to be where we wrap things up today. Thank you very much, Michelle, for joining us and sharing your thoughts. It was a great conversation. And for our audience, we hope we've provided some inspiration here for you to take a look at what your strategic planning process is, and can inject some new approaches to help liven things up and make it a more productive, more engaging process for you.
Perfect. Thank you, Chris, and thanks, Julie, for running the session, and everyone for attending. It's great to be here.
Thank you.
All right.